Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome. Thank you for joining today's community of practice. As you can see the title on the screen there, Sharing Your Story for Change, Advocacy for Preventionists. We are glad to have you with us this afternoon. But before we get started, we want to cover a few important notes. First, today's session is being recorded, as you might notice that blinking red dot at the top. So please keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking to help maintain the audio quality for everyone. We also want you to check on the settings if you can't hear us or participate. Check that you have the right audio settings on your Zoom platform, the right microphone and speaker. Also, if you're having connection issues, turning off your video might help with the bandwidth. We encourage active engagement through the session. You're welcome to use the chat reactions and other Zoom engagement tools as we go along. There will also be time for questions and discussion at the end of the session. So please feel free to note your questions as they come up, or you can drop them in chat and the moderators will be paying attention to them as they are coming in. Also want to highlight that participants must remain for the full session and complete the evaluation in order to receive your CEUs. We'll share the evaluation link at the end, so please plan to stay with us through the conclusion. With that, I'm going to hand things over to Anne Crawford, who will walk us through today's objectives and introduce our presenter. We cannot hear you, Anne, you're muted.
Okay.
There you go.
Good afternoon, everyone. I get the pleasure of introducing today's speakers. Just gonna pull this up here. Okay, so we have most of you all know Kate Frey. She serves as a vice president of advocacy of the organization and has the primary responsibility of directing and managing New Future's advocacy efforts. She also leads New Future's public health and alcohol and other drug policy portfolios. Through this work, Kate focuses on prevention-focused policies and the regulation of addictive products, alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, and prescription drugs. Kate tracks, analyzes, and synthesizes policy, budgetary, legislative proposals, best practices, and research related to public health and the regulation of addictive products. We also have Peter Ntourntourekas, who serves as the training manager at New Futures. His responsibilities include engaging, mobilizing, and training individuals and organizations that advocate for a healthy New Hampshire. Hopefully, I did not mutilate that name. And I believe, I'm not sure, Kate, if you or Peter are up first.
Thank you, Anne, for the introduction. As previously stated, I'm Peter Ntourntourekas. I'm the training manager at New Futures. I'm going to get us started. First, I want to just give a little background about who we are for those of you that aren't super familiar with New Futures. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit that works to improve the health and well-being of all Granite Staters through policy change and civic empowerment. We track a lot of legislation, a lot of public health portfolios that are all aimed to help Granite Staters live a healthier life. We try to remove as many barriers to engagement as possible through things like our action alerts and trainings. But really, the idea is that we are there to help you along the way in your whole advocacy journey from start to finish. Just for clarity's sake, I wanted to give a list of all of the issue areas that we're supporting. These are areas that we're tracking, and these are pretty big umbrellas. So if there's something that you're interested in that's not directly listed here, I still encourage you to reach out and see if we're tracking a bill that you're interested in, because there are many things underneath these umbrellas. For example, our early childhood work includes not only childcare, but also strengthening families and reducing ACEs, healthcare access, obviously a really big umbrella, and some of our newer portfolios like healthy aging contain multitudes. So feel free to reach out. if you are interested in legislation, you can view all of our priority legislation on our website. And there you can see the priorities that we have dedicated campaigns to and we're focusing on most this year. So just by the numbers, here is just some surface level data about what we did last year. So we tracked over 225 bills, and then through that, we had over 50 policy wins. That includes positive legislation and also defeating legislation that we were opposing. We had 3,400 unique advocates take over 4,100 actions, including not just things like coming and testifying at Concord at a committee hearing, but also calling their legislator, emailing committees, writing op-eds, doing online sign-in, things like that. Through those actions, we secured almost $200 million in funding for the programs we were supporting in the state budget. So I bring all of that up to say that there are tangible results to what we're doing, and I want you to feel empowered to be part of these successes and victories. So before we get into the details of advocacy and how to engage there, I want to go over our state government and kind of detail what that looks like. I think it's really important to understand the process, at least on the surface level, so that you can know when to jump in and when to time your advocacy to be most effective. So we're going to focus today on the legislative branch of our government. We call the combined state Senate and House of Representatives the General Court. That's not to be confused with the state court system. And as you are probably familiar, New Hampshire has a very large state government. We're the third largest English-speaking legislature in the world, behind the federal government and the UK House of Commons. So little old New Hampshire is incredibly representative with that 400 House reps and 24 state senators. So that does change kind of how our state legislators look as people. There are effectively volunteers. We do pay them, but we only pay them $100 per year plus mileage and I think toll reimbursement. So they're not doing this as a primary source of income. They're not professionals at this. They really are citizens that are doing this out of passion for serving their communities. So they probably have expertise in their professional lives that they're carrying into this, but it's not expected of them to already be experts in every issue area. They also don't have research staff that are helping them. So state senators have offices where they also have staffers that are managing their calendars and helping them answer emails and phone calls, but there's nobody helping them understand the 1,200 plus bills that are proposed every year. And House members don't even have staffers helping with their calls and emails. They are operating completely on their own. So with that in mind, and remembering that with 424 members, they only represent about 3,500 people on average, our state legislators are incredibly accessible. They, a lot of them answer their own phones. They will get back to you. If you email them, they could respond pretty quickly. And you may also run into them in public. It's very possible that your local House rep or even your state senator is your neighbor or just somebody you know from down the road. So as much as we want to respect the office and appreciate their time and effort and passion they're putting into this job, we also want to remember that they too are people and citizens of New Hampshire, and that they have regular lives outside of the state legislature, which has certainly lended them one or two avenues of experience, but outside of their professional lives, they're really relying on constituents to help them understand all of the things that they're not experts in. That's part of why we have such a robust public-facing process. One of the kind of results of having such a citizen-oriented legislature is that it's really important for the public to help keep these people informed. And they really look out for us during that process because they want that information and they want to be able to make the best decision that they can. So the legislative session, this is when they're meeting officially. It's a 6-month process from January to June every year. That's when bills become laws. That's when committees are meeting regularly, and that's where they're in Concord 3 or 4 times a week sometimes. We also operate on a 2-year cycle called a biennium. The first year is a budget year. Last year was a budget year. That budget is for the next biennium. So the budget for last year is for the next biennium. And even though there are no term limits on these elected offices, we do re-elect legislators and the governor every 2 years. So every 2 years, there's about a 30% turnover at the state house, which means there's about 140 new people every 2 years. So it's really important to stay plugged in to who's representing you and to maintain those relationships, especially if those offices change hands frequently in your area. Some areas have really long serving House reps that have been serving for, 20 consecutive set bienniums, but there are other areas of the state where their House rep changes every election or so. So keep plugged in with who those people are and remember that during this 6 month process, that's when they're really working hard to try to pass all of these bills. Speaking of that bill making process, I want to go over the process for how a bill becomes a law in the state of New Hampshire. I'll point out when there's specific opportunities for advocacy, because this process really is built in a way that allows for the public to come in and help legislators make the best decisions. So it's important to understand this process so you can know when to do that. So the first step of the process, we're going to call the LSR time period. LSR stands for Legislative Service Request. Any representative or senator can sponsor a bill, and to do so, they file a legislative service request with the Office of Legislative Services. These are lawyers that work for the state of New Hampshire, and it is their job to just take the legislator's idea, write it as the text of a bill, and give it back to them so they can approve it and then formally submit it. This occurs in the fall prior to the legislative session, so think like October, November, December. During this phase, they're assigned an LSR number for tracking purposes, but we don't have the full details of what a bill is or what its intent is or anything like that. You can look up LSRs, and you'll get a 1 or 2 sentence title about the topic of the bill, but you won't know the full text until it's released in late December, early January when the session starts. At this phase, they're assigned their permanent bill number. So if it was sponsored by a House member and it's going to start in the House, it gets an HB number. Likewise, if it's proposed by a senator and it's going to start there, it's given an SB number. Moving forward, that's the number that the bills retain forever. And that's how you're going to keep track of those bills. For the sake of this slide, let's pretend we're keeping track of HB 10, which is a bill that I just made up. So since HB 10 is sponsored by a House rep, it'll start the process in the House, and every bill gets assigned to a relevant committee. There's 36 standing committees in New Hampshire. There's 12 Senate committees and 24 House committees. A full list of those can be found on the GenCorp website, but basically they're organized by topic. And those committees, their job is to issue recommendations on the bill so that the whole of the House or the Senate can vote with those expert recommendations in mind. Now, with Senate committees having 5 senators and House committees having 18 House reps on them, sometimes it's not possible to fill a committee with people that have strict professional or educational experience in an area. But those reps and senators still have the job of being experts and doing deep dives on those bills so that their recommendation can be worthwhile for the rest of the House or Senate. So in the case of House Bill 10, it gets assigned to its relevant House committee where they will then schedule a public hearing. Now, this public hearing is the first big opportunity for advocacy in the legislative process, and we highly recommend participating in some way. You can obviously show up and give oral testimony in person, but you can also do things like remote sign-in or submit written testimony remotely. All of those things will let you voice your opinion on a bill, and all of those versions of testimony are part of what the committee considers. There are no requirements for attending a public hearing. You don't have to be a registered voter. You don't have to be 18. You don't have to live in New Hampshire. Really, this is just for the public to voice their opinion on a bill. And while those numbers are tabulated, it's not so official as something like voting for an office. Anybody can attend a public hearing. After the public hearing, they'll have an executive session. Now, the executive session is where the committee deliberates and they'll vote on a recommendation for the bill. The public can observe these executive sessions, but there's not time carved out for public input like there is in the public hearing. It's important to remember that while every bill gets a public hearing in New Hampshire, this committee recommendation is not going to be the life or death of the bill. It's just a recommendation. Um, this recommendation has a couple of options. Some of the more common ones are that it ought to pass, or that it ought to pass as amended if they introduce an amendment. They could recommend that it is inexpedient to legislate, meaning the bill should not pass. And then there are some things that come up frequently, like referring it to a different committee or retaining it. They could also refer it to interim study and create a study committee to study it in the off season and bring it back next year. Either way, that recommendation is voted on by the committee, and then the bill moves to the full chamber where everybody will vote on adopting that recommendation. So in the case of House Bill 10, let's say that it's recommended ought to pass. At this point, all 400 House reps vote on whether or not to adopt the committee recommendation. That's an important note because if you're ever looking up roll call vote histories for your legislator, you'll see yay or nay votes. It's important to remember that they're voting on whether or not they should adopt that recommendation. So just looking at the yay or nay does not mean that they like or don't like the bill. It means that they like or don't like the recommendation. After that full body vote, if it was to go to a second committee, that would happen here. But either way, a bill cannot advance to the next chamber without passing the full body vote. But in the case of House Bill 10, let's say that it passes, they adopt the committee recommendation that the bill passes the House. At this point, it's going to make it to crossover. Now, crossover is usually in early April-ish. It changes every year. But this is the time period where all of the bills that pass the House are going to move to the Senate, and all of the bills that pass the Senate are going to go to the House, and we do the whole process again. So in the case of House Bill 10, it would be assigned to a Senate committee now, where they would have a public hearing, they would have an executive session, and they would have a full body vote on whether or not to adopt the committee recommendation. Now, it's really important to be involved in both public hearings if your bill does make it to both chambers. These are completely separate audiences. While the House committee in this case is going to have a committee report, they're going to provide information on their vote, and all of that information is publicly available. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Senate is going to see all of that or take it all into account. You have to remember that while they are working together, the House and Senate are completely separate audiences. So if your bill passes in one chamber and then goes to the next one, you still have to continue that advocacy to make sure that both chambers are going to pass the bill. And likewise, if a bill that you're opposing makes it through one chamber, that doesn't mean that the process is over. You still have a whole second chance to deal with it in the Senate side. So it can get kind of tricky at this point, because the chambers have to agree on what should happen to a bill for it to pass. And let's say in the case of House Bill 10, it passed the House, but then when it went to the Senate, it was passed with an amendment. At this stage, they have to have a committee of conference because the House wasn't able to see that amendment before it passed. When they do that, they pluck some members from the House, some members of the Senate, and try to hash out a compromise before it moves on to the governor. Sometimes they will come up with a compromise and it'll move on. In other cases, if they can't come up with a compromise in the committee of conference, the bill will die. It's sometimes an unfortunate part of the process, but it's very important that everybody gets to vote on all of the amendments. So this is really a check and balance to make sure that the second chamber isn't going to amend the bill and change it in a way that would affect the opinions of the first chamber and how they voted. So if a bill makes it through all of that, it's going to go to the governor's desk where she has a couple options. She can sign it, she can veto it, which would prevent it from becoming law. And New Hampshire also has the option where if she doesn't touch it and they're in session, after 5 days, it'll become law without her signature. This can happen for a number of reasons, but it is to prevent things from just stalling on her desk indefinitely. And if you make it through all of that, your bill will become a law. There is, of course, the other option of overriding the governor's veto. The House and the Senate come back every year for veto day, where they look at the whole docket of every bill that the governor vetoed and see if they can override it with a two-thirds majority in the House and the Senate. This doesn't happen incredibly often with the way that the partisan lean is in the House and the Senate. It's not super common to override the governor's veto. However, it is possible and is part of the process. It has happened to bills in the past, and it is important to remember that they can also check and balance the governor there. So that's the whole process. And remember that every bill in New Hampshire has to go through this whole process from January to June. And this is the same for every bill, including the budget, which is a bill. It's a gigantic one, but the budget is a bill like any other bill. So with all of that in mind, if you want to track bills throughout this process, your number one source of information is going to be the General Court website. Now, new URL at the General Court website. I highly recommend becoming acquainted with the Gen Court website. It is your primary source of information for everything. You can look up who your reps and senators are. You can do remote sign-in for public hearings. You can find bills, read the full bill text, look at all the amendments, look at the docket, see the list of everything that's happened to it, look at committee pages, including who's on them and what they do, find their contact information, subscribe to calendars and bill updates yourself so that you're not waiting for us to tell you. A lot of this information is incredibly public facing and it is accessible on this website. This is probably the number one thing I would recommend you do if you want to keep track of this stuff yourself. And, if you've signed up for our action alerts, a lot of the information we're giving you comes directly from this website. I would also say that if you're using other sources like Legiscan or Fast Democracy, all of that information is going to come from this official source too. So if you want to get it earlier or be able to control it on a more granular scale, you can do it yourself on the GenCourt website. You can make an account and sign up for not just bill updates and committee updates, but also specific topics you're interested in, and they'll keep you updated every time a bill moves in that area. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to pass it to Kate to talk about advocacy, what that looks like, and some of the differences between lobbying and advocacy, and how to stay safe in that realm.
Thanks, Peter. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone's comfy, cozy in their warm houses after snow blowing and shoveling. And so I'm happy to walk through the next few slides on advocacy. So, we get this question a lot from organizations who are concerned about lobbying. And it's really important to understand while lobbying is one form of advocacy, advocacy can include a lot of other things that doesn't even touch on lobbying. I know some of us have to be concerned about watching our lobbying based on our regulations, either federal or state or under IRS laws. So we try to make it easy for folks to understand how they can do a whole bunch of activities without even crossing that line. Okay. So first of all, we're going to find advocacy. So it's the act or process of supporting a particular cause or proposal. And it's really important to understand while there are regulations on lobbying by the federal government, advocacy is not defined by the government. There's nothing that restricts advocacy activities based on your organization's funding status. Only those that fall into the definition of lobbying. So again, there's a whole wide range of activities you can do without even worrying about whether you're touching that lobbying line. And you can actually lobby which I'll get into if you just track a certain amount of things. So again, advocacy is the promotion of an idea or cause through education, outreach, and community organization. It includes a wide range of activities. So, for many of you who are on the call today, your main focus is prevention, preventions of making sure youth stay away from substances, making sure the broader audience understands public health implications. So a lot of the non-lobbying advocacy that you can do is building a coalition around an issue, which many of us do. And many of us are serve on a coalition, educating individuals, including lawmakers on a topic. So you can educate, and it really is your obligation as a representative of your organization to educate on the issues that your organization works on. And at the broader level, without it really getting into a call of action, you can do that with a lawmaker as well. Inviting lawmakers to an event, we really encourage folks to do this. It really gives your policymaker an idea of what's going on in their local communities. Peter touched on earlier that there are so many representatives in this state and they can't be experts on everything. And they're all often longing for information that what's going on in their community, how they can help their constituents. Writing a letter to the editor or opinion editorial. As long as it doesn't include a call to action on a bill, it's still just education and falls in that advocacy category. Writing a letter about why, working on making sure we prohibit intoxicating hemps from being sold in our grocery stores or our convenience stores or in our gas stations, why we're trying to protect youth with that. And then, of course, any nonpartisan research or analysis, a lot of what many of you do with YRBS, that is not considered lobbying. That's really just educating the community on the harms and risks that the youth are facing in your communities. Oops, I might have gone too fast. Sorry. Go back. I'm going to say this a few times. I always say this several times during our lobbying versus advocacy training, and I'll say it a few times here too. Again, remember, you can always advocate by educating without taking a position. There is nothing in any law that could stop you from doing that. So if we want to focus more on lobbying, we can hone in on what that really means, and that attempts to influence a politician or a public official to support a cause. So that's when you're taking a step away from education and doing more targeted focus on a legislator, asking your population to do that with a very specific call to action. And there are legal definitions that you just have to watch you're staying within line. If you go this route, they are the Internal Revenue Code. As a 501c3, these are the laws you have to follow to make sure you are following the guidance of a nonprofit, the Federal Consolidated Appropriations Act, and the New Hampshire state law. So when you think about lobbying too, if you're considering whether you are doing lobbying, there are really two main factors that you have to look at, and that is the employer you're working under. Are they government? Are they nonprofit? You also have to take a look at the funding you receive. You receive federal government funding from the federal government, state or local government, private dollars. These are factors that you have to consider when deciding or knowing which laws you need to follow the guidance around lobbying. So really, we focus on 501c3 organizations when we do this training. I'll go into a little bit about 501c4, but our focus is really around 501c3 organizations. And please keep in mind, you can lobby, but there are restrictions. 5% of your annual budget or less is defined as the insubstantial amount. So especially under our IRS guidelines, they will look at an organization and want to see very clearly that they're not spending a substantial amount of time lobbying. And so that falls in this 5% of the annual budget or less that they will consider insubstantial. Fortunately, too, there is another form you can fill out, a form you can fill out called 5768, and that files a 501H election, and that actually makes it so you can lobby up to 20%. That's capped at $1 million, but you can actually lobby up to that much. So if your organization is maybe doing more lobbying, that is something to definitely consider. The one thing 501c3s can't do is endorse or oppose candidates for public office. Really, they have to be nonpartisan in that respect. So 501c4s, they are a different type of organization that can do more lobbying without restrictions, and they can even endorse or oppose candidates for public office. So the really key thing to look at when you want to really decipher whether you're lobbying or not is around the calls to action. So if you're asking an audience through an email or social media or anything like that, and you're communicating with a legislator, and you're identifying the legislature as someone who represents the audience, providing the legislator's contact info, sharing the legislator's position and the legislation with the audience, and sharing the position on the committee or other specific power, any of those things is a call to action. And also, if you're expressing a view on legislation within 2 weeks of a vote, these are all things that you just want to keep in mind that draw closer to the line of lobbying and that you would want to keep track of for your IRS or your state or federal funding. But again, you can do many of these things as just education on the issue as opposed to taking that next step to the call to action on a certain way to vote on legislation. So again, a direct lobbying is communication with a legislator that expresses a view about specific legislation. This is one type of lobbying that the IRS in particular wants to know about. So if you're saying, Representative Smith, you need to vote on House Bill 123 that creates uh, uh, seat belt laws for New Hampshire, for all New Hampshire residents, you can vote with public health or you can vote against. Obviously, that's a very direct call to lobbying, and that would be something you would have to keep track of as lobbying. So they also want to know about grassroots lobbying. So, and this is where, as prevention organizations, you're probably doing more of this, is you're communicating with the public that expresses a view about specific legislation. And in that communication, it also includes a call to action. So you're informing a wider group of people in your community that Representative Smith really should get calls about voting in favor of House Bill 123 to make sure that people are wearing seatbelts in New Hampshire. So you're not actually communicating with the legislator, but you're drawing upon other people to do that. And I will say there's a lot of nuances around that. So in the example I just gave with grassroots, if you're a membership organization, you can always make that communication to your members without that being considered lobbying because the members are part of your organization. So I really encourage you, if you're interested in getting into more details, to sign up for one of our lobbying versus advocacy presentations. But anyway, the very short, to the point on this is for all of you to walk away with is not all advocacy is lobbying. Lobbying is really just one type of advocacy activity. There's a whole host of things you can do that do not cross that line of lobbying. We really talk to folks about making sure you check with your organization first, find out what the policies may be or create some policies so that everyone knows the rules and are comfortable with what they can and can do on the clock. And remember, you can always advocate off the clock. There is nothing that keeps somebody from advocating and particularly lobbying or reaching out to legislators on their own time through their own email. And then lobbying really requires that direct ask that I spoke about before, that call to action, a specific way you want to take action on a bill. But you can always advocate, but just educating on the issue. And remember, you can lobby as a 501(c)(3) organization. It just constitutes 5% of annual budget. You can go up to 20%. We do talk about in the full training how important at that point is to keep record keeping, to keep track of that time, and we give you some ideas how you can do that. And again, you can always advocate by educating without taking a direct position. And we encourage you all to do that when you can. And then I think at this point, I'm going to throw back to Peter. Is that right, Peter?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Kate, for that overview. That is, one of the questions that we get the most is how can I avoid lobbying but still engage in the process? So I hope that you all feel like you have a better understanding of where those lines are now. But with that in mind, I want to talk about what to actually do with our networks once we understand how we're going to advocate, what methods of outreach make sense, and how can we still do that effectively while not lobbying. So, um, when you start engaging in advocacy, start engaging your community networks, you really want to figure out who your people are. Who is your network? Who is your base of people that is experiencing this issue that you want to join you on your advocacy journey and help assist those advocacy efforts? So remember first that quality is way more important than quantity. Obviously, big organization like New Futures, we have a pretty big contact list, but that's not a requirement to engaging a network on advocacy. You don't need to feel like there is some minimum number of people that is effective to outreach to. Two very motivated people can absolutely flip a committee's opinion on a bill. So as long as you have a list of people that care about your issue, that's a great place to start. Make sure that you keep your contacts organized. Some of this stuff moves very fast. We didn't really get into the details of what the Senate and House committee calendars look like, but they come out on Thursday afternoon for the following week. So sometimes if there's a hearing on Monday morning, you only have one workday to rally the troops, as it were, to decide on what advocacy action to engage in. So it's really important to keep all of your information in some sort of centralized location so that you can access it easily. And the more ways of contacting your network you have, it's probably going to be better, especially if it is something that's going to move super fast. I would also say make sure that you're using an outreach method that makes sense. So obviously, when we're communicating with our entire network, we might use something like an email list or like a curated list of folks that are interested in a certain issue. That's great if you have a contact list that's that big, but consider so many other outreach methods so that you can hit people that aren't as plugged into their email, or maybe people that don't use it as a primary source of contact outside of work hours, right? Social media is great if you have a dedicated like Facebook community group to an issue, but also regionally, there are so many town and community Facebook groups full of people that are involved really deeply with their community. I mean, this is in some cases the number one way that people in a town are communicating now, is just in a private Facebook group. I'm sure we've all seen groups um, like like what's happening in Ashland or what's happening in Allenstown. It's just community members talking about what's going on in the ground. Those are still effective outreach methods because you're going to reach people that aren't necessarily a part of your official email list. Likewise, if you have a dedicated group of people that are in an inner circle, you might not need to do something so official as an email list if you have a small group of people that are already dedicated to the cause. Something as unofficial as an iMessage group chat is going to be effective with your friends and coworkers that you're close with. And it's going to be way faster than something like a email form that is going to get filtered through their work email. So consider what's best for you so that you can manage your network, but also what's best for them and the people that you're trying to outreach to. You really want to meet people where they are when it comes to advocacy communications, and that could even include multiple methods of outreach to try to get every group of people. Speaking of groups of people, there are a couple different targets for building your network. They all interact with you and the issue in different ways, and you're probably going to interact with them in different ways. It's important to identify which group you're talking to when you're trying to build your network so that you can strategize. But I wanted to outline them here. This is in the most general sense, the kind of three different groups that you might be interacting with when you're building your network. The first of which is partners and allies. These are people that you know professionally, but are not already engaged in the issue. These might be coworkers or community partners that you know are engaged in the same kind of work, or they're seeing the same things on the ground that you're seeing, but they're not particularly engaged with advocacy, with your advocacy effort. That is a great group of people to reach out to because they're kind of known quantities to you. You know what they're seeing, you know what organization they might work for, you might know them personally. That's all very helpful for organizing an advocacy effort. There is also new audiences. So there could be people with connections to the issue that aren't connected to you that you could directly outreach to. Here again, there are community Facebook groups, for example, that are dedicated to issues. Like, for example, there may be a Facebook group in your area of people seeking childcare. And if that's something you're interested in, you may want to reach out to that group to see if they'll engage with your advocacy effort, even if they've never interacted with your organization before. That's a great group of people to work with because even though you might not know them as people yet, you do know that they're connected to the issue. So they will have something, they're going to want to be engaged with your advocacy effort because they're too affected by the problem. And of course, you can do general outreach to the public without having this sort of targeted idea of who they are or what they know. Obviously, the rate of return on this is going to be a little lower, but it's impossible to be completely plugged into every community and every group that's going through the same kinds of problems that you're seeing. So this general public outreach might not yield you the most numbers, but it is going to touch people that you might not be aware of otherwise. So it's still very effective for building your network. If you think of like a long-term community building approach, you want to touch as many people as possible. You also want to make sure that you're supporting your people. So build relationships with advocates or people in the community. You want to talk about their stories responsibly, ethically. Make sure that they don't feel like this is transactional or that you're using them for their story. You want to support them as much as possible with things like talking points, data, resources, handouts. If you have an informational one-pager that you're giving to legislators, give that to your advocates too, so that they can be working with the same information that you all are. As much as we are trying to help keep legislators educated, we also want to make sure that we're keeping our advocates educated. And likewise, if they have read a study or something that's changed their opinion, don't be afraid to take that into account when you're engaging in advocacy as an organization. You also want to keep them updated, not just with what's going on. Like, for example, our action alerts are largely to let you know what's going on, but the follow-up of letting them know why it matters is equally as important. If you engage in a large advocacy effort and it goes the way you want, maybe you get a bill passed that you were all working on, letting them know that that's where that ended up is really important. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of everything going on at the State House. 1,200 bills, 6 months, it can get really tight and things can get confusing, and especially something like a budget year where things are getting stapled to the budget suddenly. So doing the work of keeping them updated with the results of their actions is really important for keeping them in the fight. So when you are doing outreach, there are really two main kinds of outreach asks. There's mass appeals and there's direct appeals. Both of these are useful for different reasons. A mass appeal is when you're outreaching to all of your contacts about an important advocacy opportunity. For example, just blasting out to everybody in your network, hey, there's a hearing on this day. Here's the link to like look at what the bill is about. But something like a direct appeal, when you're connected to an individual and you know that they have a story that needs to be heard, or you know that they specifically want to be kept up to date with an issue, is going to get them to take action way more than something generalized like a mass appeal. Direct appeals get you way more results because you're leveraging that personal relationship you've built with them rather than including them in the giant faceless mass of people that you're doing a mass appeal to. For either one of these outreach methods, you still want to stick with these 5 key points to make sure that you're including all of the relevant information to keep them plugged in. So you want to first explain what is going on, tell them what the bill is, explain the bill, explain maybe the consequences of the bill, but also just letting them know what is happening. If it's a public hearing, if it's an executive session, if you're outreaching to the governor, those are very important details to include up front so they know what kind of action they're gearing up for. Emphasize why it's important that they act, because people need to feel like they're actually doing something that's going to move the needle when they're engaging in advocacy. Some feedback we hear a lot on the ground is that people feel like, what can I actually do to move the needle? So emphasizing why it's important that they do the action you're advocating for is going to help mobilize people. But even more importantly than that, offering multiple options is really good to help meet advocates where they are. For example, our action alerts will include multiple avenues like online sign-in and emailing legislators and directly coming and testifying. So people that feel like their skills align a certain way can engage the way that is most effective for them, and also meets their time requirements. If we're outreaching to other community partners and professionals, we're all busy people, and sometimes we can't come down to Concord on a Wednesday afternoon to testify. So giving other ways to engage and giving them clear instructions on how to do so is going to be really effective. As an example of a mass appeal that was really effective, last year there were a couple bills that went semi-viral on Facebook where people were copy and pasting instructions for online sign-in along with bill information in comments in community Facebook groups. Those bills had tens of thousands of people sign in opposed them. And just for reference, I was listening to a public hearing earlier today, and there were 13 people signed in total on a bill. So 30,000 is an astronomical number that's very hard to ignore. That was all possible because not only were people giving information on what the bill is and what to do about it, but also clear instructions on how to complete online sign-in, including like a link to the website. Letting people do something with their hands on their phone when they get the information is going to increase engagement a lot. And of course, emphasizing that support is available, letting people know that they're not alone, and letting them know that you can help them along the way. For example, your organization, New Futures, if there's somebody that can help them kind of figure out the process if they get lost, that's going to make them feel way more courageous when it comes to actually engaging. And after all of these efforts, you really want to prevent burnout. We hear from some advocates that they want to be at every public hearing. They want to testify on all 10 of these bills. They want to write an op-ed every week. It's just not humanly possible or healthy to be 100% engaged 100% of the time. So make sure that you're only outreaching when it's really important. For example, we try to only email our lists once a week. We give them like a weekly update, and then if something emergent happens, we're giving them that. But we're not emailing people every day on every issue. Too many updates will start to overwhelm your base, and people will start to check out. You also should consider if it should be a direct ask or a mass appeal. Too many mass appeals will start to feel impersonal. Something I say at other trainings about our emails is that they're written by us, and you can reply to them and we'll answer you. And that's true. That's not something I make up so that you'll sign up for the emails. It's a true thing. So that human aspect makes your asks maintain priority in something as messy as an inbox. And like I said earlier, make sure you're following up with how that action made a difference. If a bill goes the way you want, let people know that their actions had impact. And even if it didn't, every action you take is contributing to the greater cultural conversation, and that's still moving the needle. So make sure that you're encouraging people to want to take action again through these asks. So the key thing to advocacy that we emphasize a lot at New Futures, we've heard from legislators is really important. Um, the focus on the personal story is really the thing that is going to make your advocacy efforts stand out amongst the crowd of people engaging. Stories are proven to be more memorable, relatable, repeatable, and effective at changing minds than data alone. That is interestingly enough backed by data. That's not to say don't use data. Data is very important. We love data. It is an incredible tool, but it should be used to contextualize your story. The story is the thing that you can bring to this that nobody else can bring to it. Everybody has data. That's the thing we like about data is that it's empirical and impersonal, and it doesn't care who you are, the numbers don't change. However, um, the story does change person to person, and that's the thing that's going to be memorable. When people tell gut-wrenching emotional testimony at a committee hearing, that makes everybody pause and listen. When the third industry lobbyist comes up with a bunch of data, people start to glaze over by the end of the hearing. These stories are the thing that get told in the hallways more than faceless statistics. Now, again, using data to contextualize that story um, is very important if you have access to the data, but it shouldn't be the only thing that is part of your advocacy. So, with this story thing, we're going to kind of get into a little bit of a writing exercise. If you're on your computer and you don't have access to something like a notepad, I recommend taking this slide or the next slide to open up like a Word doc or a notepad on your computer, because we're going to do some writing in a second. If you want to write on a physical piece of paper, absolutely do that, and I applaud you for having that within arm's reach. My hope is that after this, we'll take some time to write, and if anybody feels particularly good about it, they can share. But either way, I want to leave you with a template of what an effective advocacy message is so that you can take your idea, put it on paper, and then shape that into a bunch of different other advocacy messages. This kind of first story draft can be really effective to help you see all of your thoughts in an organized way without feeling overwhelming, especially for something that we're passionate about or that we're experts in. It can feel like we could talk for hours about an issue. But, if, for example, you're giving oral testimony, you're only going to have 2 or 3 minutes to speak. So being able to organize your thoughts in this way is really helpful. And I'm hoping that you find it helpful too. So when we think about an effective advocacy message, really there are three main things that are non-negotiable. One, the personal story. This is, like I said, the thing that only you can bring, and it should be the major focus of your advocacy message. This is the thing that you have personally. And it's the reason that you should be engaging in advocacy is that you have a story to tell. Then you want to follow that story up with data. You want to use the story to humanize that data and put a face to it. It's one thing to hear that 28% of people are affected by a thing. It's another thing to hear that this person sitting in front of you has been affected by it. And then at the end of that, you really want to follow up, if you can do this, with a firm ask. Now, if you can support or oppose the legislation, absolutely do that. But your ask could be something too, as like, engaging with the bill in good faith or asking that they consider all of the information before making their vote. Those are equally valid asks. You just want to make sure that you have something concrete that the recipients of your message can do with your story. So that when you're sticking in their mind, they're also thinking about how they're going to take that story and use it to inform their actions afterwards. Now, there are some factors to consider when you're crafting an advocacy message. Really, there are these two big umbrella things I'm going to throw at you. One, who is your audience? That could just mean, am I talking to a legislator or am I not talking to a legislator? But it also means who is the audience as a person. The GenCourt website includes incredible personal bios on most of our legislators. I highly recommend that you, in the same way that you want to humanize yourself and your story, humanizing your legislators or members of a committee is equally as important. People, in the same way that we are multifaceted and we have lived our whole lives and have these sets of experiences and opinions that have shaped us to believe certain things, the legislators have that too, right? It's really difficult to completely change someone's life experience with one conversation. So you can't seek to change their mind without first understanding who they are and how they came to that viewpoint. So it's very important to understand your audience the same way you want them to understand you. Also know how much time you have. Now, that does mean how much time do you have to speak. If you're making a phone call, have a 1 minute elevator pitch. If you're writing something and there's a word limit restriction, keep that in mind. But I also mean how much time do you have to complete this action? If you're trying to, gather a bunch of stories on Monday for a hearing on Tuesday, you're going to have a big time crunch. You might want to rethink your strategy. If you are talking in the off season about an upcoming legislation and you don't have some strict time requirement like a public hearing, you can take way more time to make your advocacy longer, have a more conversational approach over time, as opposed to something like a hearing where there's a deadline, right? So what I'm going to go over now is our story writing template. This is the advocacy message template that we give to advocates when they first start telling their story. I'm going to go over this using an example of an op-ed that one of our advocates wrote last year, where she followed this message template really effectively. This was sorry, I didn't mean to click that. This is a op-ed that was about vaccines. I encourage you to write about whatever you're passionate about. And, uh, even if you have to make up a bill number, that's completely fine. The idea here is that you go through the process of dumping your thoughts onto paper and letting them filter into these categories. I'm not expecting you to write some like fully fleshed out paragraphs, but if you can throw bullet points into each of these categories, it gives you a really good start into then crafting it into what your advocacy action is going to be. So the first category I want you to throw thoughts into is your introduction. Here you're including relevant information about yourself and your connection to the issue. So your lived experience, your work experience, your educational background, those are all really important things to include if you can include. Obviously, you don't want to represent your organization without explicit permission to do so, but you can still talk about your professional experience in more abstract ways. And here is a paragraph from our advocate's op-ed where that was her introduction. She says, as a professional epidemiologist with a master's in public health, board president of an early childhood education center in the Upper Valley, and most importantly, mother to a 3-year-old little girl, I'm deeply concerned about New Hampshire legislation that would amend childhood immunization requirements. Now, here, her introduction checks all of the boxes. She gives us her professional experience. She gives us her educational experience, Master's of Public Health, tells us that she's board president of an early childhood education center, and then gives us the personal lived experience of being a mother to a 3-year-old little girl. So she's got all these different angles that are all connected to the issue, and they're all equally important to include. So we have a pretty good picture of who she is while she's telling this story. Then you want to get into your challenge. What is the issue you're trying to address? This is how your community is being affected by the problem. You really want to outline that and give it a human angle so that your audience can understand the challenge fully. In this case, she was opposing a bill, so she says House Bill 679 would prevent the state from including any vaccine not shown in clinical trials to prevent transmission of disease. It would roll back all current vaccine requirements, as none of those required have been shown to prevent transmission completely. However, all have been shown in clinical trials to be highly effective at reducing the severity of symptoms and preventing death. So she explains the bill, the intention of the bill, and then she talks about the challenge with the intention of the bill and explains that it is maybe a little misguided. You want to immediately follow that up with solutions. Now, if there is a policy solution you're advocating for or against, this goes in the solution. However, it doesn't always have to be so strict as having a legislative ask. You could just be providing abstract solutions like, funding for this program could be effective, things like that. Um, it could also be a solution that is just so simple as we all need to understand the issue fully before creating permanent solutions. So, in the case of our advocate, she writes, the lack of vaccination requirements will also make my daughter's school, along with numerous others across the state, no longer eligible for federal funding. Already in a tight budget, we need all the financial help we can get to keep operating, to protect our children, their education, and our communities. I urge legislators and Governor Ayotte to oppose House Bill 679. So, here, of course, she has the strict legislative ask to oppose the bill, but there are other abstract solutions that are very valuable too. She doesn't need the oppose House Bill 679 here. She explains how, addressing these financial needs is part of the solution. And then you want to close with your impact. How would the solution actually affect the community? Consider the actual human impacts. And if you can provide personal human examples of how the solution would affect the community, that's going to last in the minds of legislators way more than just data about how people might be affected or how they are affected on average. A strict personal example is far more memorable. And in the case of our advocate, she writes, viruses and bacteria are ever changing, making it incredibly difficult to correctly identify and kill them. Therefore, we use vaccines to teach our own bodies how to fight disease agents. Young kids get sick often, and although we can't always stop illnesses from spreading, vaccines help keep them from experiencing severe illness. I want my child and her friends to be safe at school as they play and learn. I also want school staff who provide an incredible public service to be protected. This is a great impact because she not only explains the impact of the bill, but she also gives us community impacts, explaining that she wants her child and her friends to be safe, and that she also wants school staff to be safe. So that op-ed was published. You could find it if you Googled some of that language. But I use it as an example here because she did a fantastic job of using this message template to dump all her thoughts on the paper and kind of use that as fuel that she could then stitch together into that op-ed. So what I'm hoping we can do now is I'm going to give everybody until 2:40 to jot some thoughts down on paper if you can follow this template on your own, and then we'll reconvene. And I'm hoping that somebody feels so good about what they wrote that they're willing to share with the class so that we can just briefly talk about how you have used these categories to your benefit. All right, I'm going to pull everybody back. Does anybody feel like they are willing to share what they wrote? If you are, you could raise your hand and then maybe the powers that be could help unmute you. If nobody's willing, that's completely fine. I'm not going to put you on the spot. But if anybody feels great about it, I would love to hear what you wrote. Okay, I don't see anybody, so we're going to move on. But keep your writing in front of you as we look at these next few slides, because what I'm hoping you have in front of you is a meaningful first draft that you can then kind of craft into any advocacy method that you're planning on engaging in. So, there are a bunch of ways to share a story once it's been written out like this. Calling elected officials, writing letters to the editor. Even in New Hampshire, you can have coffee with an elected official. There's nothing stopping you from reaching out to your local House rep and seeing if they'll chat about what's going on in the community. We're going to talk specifically about calling elected officials, writing for newspapers, and testifying in person briefly. So just as an example, if you are calling elected officials, you want to keep your message very concise. Consider a 1 or 2 minute elevator pitch. Remember, especially that if you're calling House reps, you're calling their personal phone number. So there's a good chance that you're going to get their answering machine, or their spouse or their kid could pick up the phone. So you may need to ask for a call back. Because of that, it's really important to have a short elevator pitch that gives them something to latch onto so that they want to call you back for more information and so that they can remember everything you said really readily. Using our advocate's op-ed as an example, here are some bullet points you might pull out to keep a concise phone call. So from her introduction, you just pull out, I'm an epidemiologist and a mother with a 3-year-old in your district, right? Personal connection, name that you're a constituent. I'd like to talk to you about House Bill 679, which would prevent the state from including certain vaccines in the childhood vaccine schedule. I'm concerned that schools would be unsafe for both my children and the staff that support them. I'm also concerned that it would impact funding, so it's critical to oppose the bill. I hope I can count on your vote. What is that, 30 seconds of speaking if I said it all at once? So if you can take something like the advocacy message template that you've put all your thoughts on, just pull out 1 or 2 bullet points from each section, that gives you a very concise phone script so that you can have something in front of you that respects their time. Remember, especially in the case of House reps, if you get off of work and you decide that you need to call your legislator when you get home at 6 o'clock, they are also most likely getting home at 6 o'clock and probably won't have a whole lot of time to talk to you on the phone. So you just want to give them enough information so that they can then consider what you said and maybe ask for a call back if they want more information. When writing LTEs, it's important to remember the differences between an LTE and an op-ed. Now, LTEs are a little more informal. They're also published way faster and way more frequently. A lot of newspapers published every LTE they get online. Even though they're not printing them in the physical paper, you'll still get published on their website and you can share that on social media. You can also send it directly to legislators or the community or whatever. Something else I will say is that maybe you don't read the newspaper, but if there's one place where the newspaper is alive and well, it's the New Hampshire State House. Many legislators read the newspaper in between committee hearings, walk around with it under their arm all day. So they're definitely reading the big state papers and probably also their local papers. So structure for an LTE, remember you're looking at 200 to 250 words. You really want one beefy paragraph. So you would want to pick one point that you're making in your advocacy message template and just expand on it. So you want a 1 or 2 sentence hook where you reference the specific action that you're trying to complete and include who you are. For example, in this case, referencing another LTE or October 15th article on this House Bill committee hearing overlooked testimony, and then you are trying to explain that testimony. So your core argument for an LTE is really only going to be 2 to 4 sentences. You want to make one main point. I know it's hard to not cover everything, but making one point really well is going to be more effective than making 10 points surface level. So support your one argument with New Hampshire specific facts, statistics, or personal experience, and connect it to the broader implications for other New Hampshire residents. Remember that if you can connect this to specific community examples, it's going to be more effective than just data on its own. And then you always want to conclude with whatever call to action you can include. If you want them to contact their state rep, say that. If you want to urge something more specific, like urging the committee to vote a specific way or supporting the bill, this is where you include that. But even if you can't include that, you always want to end with the impact for New Hampshire. Explain how New Hampshire communities will be affected. Now, some best practices for this, make sure that you're noting word limits, formatting requirements, and response times. LTEs are usually published pretty fast, often between 24 and 72 hours. So, you can be pretty timely. If you find out on Thursday there's a hearing next week, you can reasonably get an LTE published if you hurry up. Something like an op-ed is going to take more time, but even still, op-eds are very valuable for larger conversations that are not quite so time sensitive, and you also have way more room to run. Op-eds are usually 600 to 800 words, written by an expert in a field or somebody with really specific experience that can speak to an issue. These are often written in conjunction with the editor from a newspaper, so they will give you feedback or ask for something like a bio or a headshot so they can include your op-ed. So similarly, if you want to consider an op-ed as having the same format as a 5-paragraph essay from high school, that's going to be a pretty effective template for you to follow. Your first paragraph, you're going to likewise start with a compelling anecdote about New Hampshire, a provocative question, establish why they should care, including what the issue is and who you are. But then you want to close that off with your thesis. So you want to state a main argument, including something like whether we're supporting or opposing a bill, and establishing your credibility. Why are you the person they should listen to about this issue? Your body here can include more than one argument, but your arguments want to support that one thesis that you started with. So here you can have 2 or 3, maybe even 4 major points. You can also address counter arguments because you have the room to do that. As long as you're connecting your points logically and including details about New Hampshire communities, this is going to be an effective body. And if you can reference how similar policies have worked or failed elsewhere, that's going to be helpful too. Your conclusion in an op-ed is going to be, reinforcing your thesis, restating what that thesis is, and circling back to all of those claims you made at the beginning. And if you can end with a memorable call to action, that's going to be effective so that they can do something with the information you've given them. So I also want to briefly go over testifying in person. This is the big intimidating thing that people think about when they think about state advocacy. But I want to say it's not that scary once you've done it. I've had advocates attend one training and then immediately go to the budget public hearing and testify in front of 400 people. We've also had advocates as young as 6 years old testify at public hearings. So as long as you're prepared and you're willing to speak passionately to the committee, you can absolutely do this. I also want to say that all of the committee public hearings are live streamed on YouTube. So if you want to watch one, you can just search for New Hampshire State House and New Hampshire State Senate and see how they go, see what the conversations are like. And I think that'll help, assuage some of your anxieties around this. So when you do testify in person, obviously you want to recognize the chairperson, members of the committee, state your name, where you're from, establish who you are, establish your position on the bill, or that you're just there to educate and you're neutral on the bill. But the focus of your time should be your advocacy message. The main reason I want to mention in-person testimony is that I think one of the barriers is that advocates can sometimes be worried about the interrogation from the committee afterwards, that they're going to press you about statistics or your story. It's important to remember that one, it's supposed to be a conversation and not an interrogation, but two, you don't actually have to answer any questions. There's nothing compelling you to answer questions about your really personal traumatic testimony. Likewise, if they ask you about a stat and you don't actually know the information that they're asking, it's okay to say, I don't know, I'll get back to you later. That's actually kind of a cheat code for getting more engagement. If they ask you about a statistic or a study that you reference and you don't have an answer off the top of your head, saying, I don't know, but I'll get back to you helps your credibility, and it, lets them know that you understand when you don't know something and you're willing to admit that you need more information. But it also gives you a doorway to continue the conversation when you do follow up. So, great hidden trick is to decline questions and kind of ask to follow up later. But of course, if you do know the answer to a question, I highly encourage you to just answer their question so that they can be working with the same level of information that you are. Something else we've seen is if you testify and they ask a question, but you're testifying with a group of people and somebody else in your group that hasn't gone yet can answer their question, you can always refer to that person too. Maybe if there's somebody at the hearing that is watching that you know has the answer, you can always refer to them. Remember that it's supposed to be a conversation and that they want to hear you speak. So, with all of that in mind, I hope that I've left you with something useful for this 90 minutes. Also, remember that New Futures is here to support you in your advocacy. So if you lose track of a bill during the session, if you need help publishing an LTE, don't know who to talk to, if you need help doing online sign-in, finding out who's on a committee, you can always reach out to me and I will happily help you navigate that process. With that, I think we have some time for Q&A if there are questions. I don't see any in the chat, but now is the time to ask them, right?
Hi, Danny. I have a quick question. This is Candace. I'm the prevention administrator for the Bureau of Drug and Alcohol Services. A lot of the folks on the call today, at probably some point or another, are going to be asked to bring some kiddos to potentially testify on some of our bills. And I was just curious if you can kind of talk about maybe some best practices for preparing them and also kind of talk about the interrogation piece for the kids, because I think that's what really scares some kids is the questions afterwards, and they're certainly not as accustomed to saying, I'll get back to you kind of thing. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that for a second.
Interestingly enough, and Kate, I'm going to want your input on this because this was a little before my time. But I said, for example, we had 6-year-olds testify, but that's like a true story. A couple years ago, we had a 6-year-old testify on a bill, and she just stood up there. It was a bill to ban social emotional learning in schools, and she came with her mom, who is one of our coworkers, sat down at the table, adjusted the microphone, told them about how that's her favorite class, showed them the breathing exercise that she does in class. She got a standing ovation from the committee. They were so excited to just hear from her and see her. There are still legislators that will like point her out at the state house if they see her. So really, in my short experience, anytime a kid is present, they're just so excited that a kid is there in the first place. Those are voices that they don't have as much access to. A youth in general, those are voices that they don't get as much of. So they're really excited to hear from those voices because it's just not what they usually get. Kate, thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great point, Peter. Yeah, I think, for the most part, Peter's absolutely right. They're just very excited to have you there. So for the most part, they're just supportive and engaged. I think Vicki Harris was on the call, but she's an expert in this, obviously, and some other coalitions who bring youth who maybe, in middle school or high school, sometimes they will be challenged by legislators. And I know that a lot of times these coalitions work with their kids to kind of come up with that response or have them feel more comfortable because that's part of the process. So you could work with them to prepare them a little bit. But at the end of the day, like Peter said, they have every right to just not take questions or say, being very clear if they don't know, just let them know that and they can follow up possibly. But for the most part, I agree with Peter. Legislators are just very happy to have youth there and are usually complimentary, um, more so than adversarial.
Thank you. I also had the pleasure of watching the 6-year-old's testimony when she was up there. So it was very adorable and she did a wonderful job.
Any other questions? I still don't see any in the chat, so.
And I think Peter and Kate, we have access to your slides. Are you okay if we share these out for folks after this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, completely fine.
Awesome. Looks like you just have some accolades in the comments in the chat. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. And this was a really wonderful presentation. I've seen bits of this presentation and I've never had the opportunity to see it all together. So that it was really great to kind of get all of the pieces. And thank you so much for joining us. And I'll turn it back over, I believe, to Danny to close this out.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you very much. And thank you, Peter and Kate, for your insights and the presentation, also for answering that question right there at the end. As mentioned before, first, we want to thank everyone for participating, all for the engagement and participation from the presenters and everybody attending. As we bring today's session to a close, we want to ask you to please take a moment to complete the evaluation survey, which is required to receive the CEUs, as we mentioned at the beginning. I just dropped the link in chat right now. You can access it using that link. Your feedback is extremely valuable and helps us to continue to shape future sessions to best meet your needs. Thank you again for joining today's Community of Practice, sharing your story for change, advocacy for preventionists. We appreciate your time and commitment. We also want to plug our website here. If you want to see the recording for this session or other COPs, prior COPs that we have had, please visit nhtac.org. You're going to find technical assistance to practitioners, communities, policymakers, and other stakeholders that work across the alcohol and other drug continuum of care. Thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you next time.